after having a 25-11 lead and going on a Boston going on a 76-44 run, really put you in your place in many ways. To talk more about the Sixers as well as the NBA playoffs, we welcome back to 97.3 ESPN Bryan Toporek. He's the co-host of the NBA podcast, quality editor for Bleacher Report, and also contributor for Forbes Sports. Bryan, how you doing this Thursday?
I'm doing well, Josh. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. I'm glad you could jump on today because this is an opportunity for us to really just rip apart this Sixers team. And I got to start with what Legler just mentioned there in that cut from earlier today, and that is, at some point, it's on Embiid. Yes, it's on Tobias Harris. But the coach is not totally without blame. And while so many times we try to explain to people that the players got to play and the coach is coach, it feels like that there is nobody without blame anymore in the result of the mess we saw last night.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I mean, it's a top-down failure. It's just an organizational-wide failure from the players to the coaching staff to the front office to the ownership group. Every single person has some share of blame in the product that we are seeing melt down on the court. I've been a very ardent supporter of Brett Brown throughout the years. I thought the chatter about his job security last year was unfair, especially, I mean, he adjusted really well and coached well in that Toronto series in particular. This series, we haven't seen it as much. I mean, we'll see what happens tomorrow night, but I don't think anything we've seen outside of really the first quarter last night gives you any confidence that things are going to change.
You mentioned the whole organization, and I was talking about it earlier before you came on. You know, you look at an organization like the Miami Heat, and obviously not every organization like the Miami Heat can be like that, but organizations that win championship, there's a continuity of culture from the owner to the GM to the coach to the players, and they don't just bring in anybody. They're not always out there big game honey. I mean, you know, the Miami Heat don't sign Timothy Mozgov to $60 million, right? So there's, you know, they don't trade Kyrie Irving away and then fire their GM, right? Like, they don't do stuff like the Cavs did. So is there something besides the fact that the culture of the Sixers and the lack of identity with them is really the root of the problem here?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I mean, I think it goes back to the early phases of the process, and when, you know, you commit to a long-term rebuild with Sam Hinkie and then cut his legs out halfway through, and it feels like they've kind of just been flailing between different visions ever since. I mean, between Hinkie, Colangelo, the interim GM front office, the Hydra that they had, and now Elton Brand, we've gone through 3 or 4 GM groups in the past 5 years, however you want to look at it. And, you know, it feels like basically everything in the past 2 or 3 years, really since the loss to the Celtics a few years ago in the playoffs, it's just like they're swinging a pendulum of overreaction back and forth. Like, they thought they were ready to compete. So, you know, they made some win now trades. They trade for Jimmy Butler. They trade for Tobias Harris. Then they lose in the Raptors and, you know, get blown off the floor whenever Joel Embiid's not on the court. So then they go out and sign Al Horford to make sure they have insurance, but they like completely neglected. You know, it's good in the NBA in 2020 to have guards who can actually shoot and dribble and pass. Like, Ben Simmons is, without Ben Simmons, which, you know, he's out with this knee injury, they don't have a single average point guard on this roster. And against a team like Boston that has a bunch of good defensive wings, that flaw has become fatal.
You mentioned the 3 different general managers. What can Elton Brand do to fix this problem, if anything? Because let's be realistic. At some point, if you bring in a new head coach, who's the guy hiring and interviewing him? It's Elton Brand in that front office. So what can Elton Brand actually do to fix these issues?
There is not a good answer to this question, unfortunately. I mean, last summer was really that was their opportunity to lock into the roster that they were going to build around Ben and Joel. They had a lot of flexibility, a lot of cap space. They made their choices. They let Jimmy go or signed and traded him to Miami. They re-signed Tobias. They spent a ton on Al Horford. They're kind of locked in here. Like, Tobias Harris and Al Horford are among the worst contracts in the NBA right now. No team is going to willingly take them on unless the Sixers dangle something else, whether it's Matisse Thybulle, whether it's, the 21 pick that they just got. They have 4 second-rounders. They definitely will not be using all of those. So I'm assuming they're going to try to dangle some combination of those picks, maybe Josh Richardson, because I don't know if they plan to re-sign him in 2021, and try to move off of one of these big contracts. But it's not going to be easy, especially, there's a lot of financial uncertainty hanging over the league right now. The salary cap is probably not going to go up as much as expected. There aren't very many teams with cap room. Like, I know it's a parlor game on Sixers Twitter to come up with Al Horford trade ideas and trade destinations. I think it's going to be a lot harder than people expect.
Bryan Toporek joining me here on the Boardwalk on the Hotline on 97.3 ESPN. Make sure you check out the NBA podcast with himself and Morton Jensen. I'm sure you guys will have about 200 trade possibilities, and Morton will probably shoot down about almost every single one of them, but on the pod there. But on a serious note, I think the one thing that could play into the Sixers' advantage in trying to either unload Horford and or Richardson is the fact that there is not a great free agent class this offseason. And we know that, the NBA in this fluid environment where the NBA could start in December, it could be January, nobody knows. But what we do know is that the free agent class and then the draft itself, which is a totally another hogposh of craziness because of the lottery tonight. And, the fact that there's a possibility that LaMelo Ball could be the first overall pick still makes me scratch my head, honestly. But is there a possibility that there's a team that says, I don't like the free agent crop, and if I'm going to go out and use some of my salary cap and make some changes, that maybe taking on an Al Horford or a Josh Richardson is my way of getting around the situation?
Yeah, it's definitely possible. Part of the problem is there aren't that many teams with salary cap space. It's really like 4 or 5, maybe 6, depending on where the cap comes in. Most of them are very bad teams. Miami's going to have some space, but they're probably going to keep it open for, making a run at Giannis or another superstar in 2021. So maybe they just use it to re-sign Goran Dragic or hand out a 1-year deal to someone like Danilo Gallinari. So I don't think they have any interest in Al Horford. Atlanta has a ton of cap space, but he already played there. They let him walk. They have John Collins, Clint Capella. I don't see why they would take him either. So now we're looking at like Charlotte, Detroit. I think ultimately what's going to happen if they are able to flip Horford, it's going to be Horford for another guy on a not great contract. And even still, it's going to be hard to find someone on an equally bad contract. So I think, the Kings are a popular theoretical landing spot for Horford because they have Buddy Hield, who is very dissatisfied with his role, and he would fit really well next to Ben and Joel. But I don't think the Kings are doing Buddy Hield for Al Horford straight up. I don't even think they do Buddy Hield for Al Horford in the number 21 pick. Like, would it require including Thybulle? Would it require, turning it into a bigger deal and including Josh Richardson, and they throw in Harrison Barnes? I don't know. But this is what the front office is paid for. They're going to have to call every single team in the league. And, it's going to be no secret, especially if they get swept out of the first round or knocked out in 5 games. All 29 other teams know Tobias, Josh, Al are all going to have, a for sale sign over their heads. But it's a matter of canvassing the league and seeing, A, does anyone even want these guys? And B, what's the least we have to give up to get off of their contract?
If we could just stay on that point really quick, I think the Harrison contract, the Harrison Barnes contract makes a lot of sense, though, because they're going to be getting a new GM. Vlade Divac stopped down, and it's like, hey, I'm gonna take your albatross off your hands if you take my albatross off my hands. And let's be realistic, that Bagley pick is looking worse by the day. So, maybe it's a situation where if you find a third team, you could dump Bagley off on somebody. You take on Barnes and you take on Hield, and like you said, maybe you do have to, give up that 21st overall pick. But I think that at least in this, for Sixer fans, if you can make some changes along with changing the head coach, it's an opportunity for at least what feels like, maybe not literally, but it feels like a clean slate.
Right. Yeah. I mean, honestly, it wouldn't shock me if, I think if they don't bounce back in this series, if they're out in 4 or 5, Brett is a dead man walking at this point. But it wouldn't surprise me if that ultimately is the big change they make this offseason, and they go into next season pretending that a new coach will fix everything, or maybe, whoever they draft at number 21 will fix things. They'll have their taxpayer mid-level exception that they can use, hopefully on a point guard. So maybe that will fix things. Like, I think they're going to try to hope that a new coach can unlock better success with Al and Joel, and then with those two guys and Ben in particular. Like, maybe Ben spends the next 4 to 5 months working on a jump shot and, comes back whenever the season starts next year as an actually willing shooter, because that would change some of the fit issues. But again, I think it's going to be a lot harder to trade some of these guys than we would like. I just think they have so much money owed to them, and it's not even just the money, it's the years. I think it'll be easier to trade them in a year or two when their contracts aren't running 2, 3, 4 years down the road. But right now, it's just such a massive thing to ask another team to take on. Like, it would not surprise me if they're more or less stuck with this roster for the next year. And maybe if a new coach comes in and nothing improves and, they're still a middling up and down team all year, maybe that's when you take a sledgehammer to them at next year's trade deadline.
Let's jump down that rabbit hole for the head coach. And please don't tell me anybody with the last name Van Gundy. I don't want to hear about anybody who is coached in 20 different places and been fired from all of them. I don't care. To me, the two names that stand out to me the most, at least, is number one is Ty Lue, not just because he's a hot name, but because after reading the book of Return of the King, the explanation of Tyronn Lue's relationship with the players really makes a lot of sense to me and to what he could do in Philadelphia. The other guy's name that stands out to me, and you can tell me what names make sense to you, is Sam Cassell, because he's on Doc Rivers' staff. Sam has a previous relationship with Elton Brand. They've known each other for a very long time, and I think Sam is the kind of guy, because he's a former player, I think that the quote-unquote former player might need to be the way you go down with these kind of, for lack of a better term, enigmas that are on this roster.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I don't know that any coach is going to be able to fix some of the issues. Like, I don't think if you brought in prime Phil Jackson, he would have a great answer to some of the fit questions that are hanging over this roster. So I don't think there's a perfect solution here. I have a better answer in terms of guys I would not like. And as you mentioned, I mean, Stan Van Gundy, I'm not as opposed to that as you are, it sounds like. But he has clearly been lobbying for it pretty hard throughout his announcer gig anytime he's been covering a Sixers game in the bubble. Kenny Atkinson is another guy who had a lot of success with the Nets. There's some concern, I think kind of the same perception with Brett is, great guy to steward your program through a rebuild, but is he the right guy, X's and O's wise, to get you to that championship level? When you have the talent, can he actually get you there? So, and I don't know the answer to that question. But I think the guys you mentioned are both good candidates. Ty Lue is going to be, it sounds like, a hot name basically across the NBA. I mean, we'll see what happens with Houston. They just went up 2-0 in their series, but there was some speculation that Mike D'Antoni could be in trouble with an early playoff exit. Pelicans and Bulls both have openings as well. So I think Lue in particular will probably have his pick of the litter. And whether he wants to, I guess it'll come down to, like, do you want to join a rebuilding team like the Bulls or a team like the Pelicans that's young, that has really bright talent, young talent, or, kind of a win now situation like the Sixers. But I think all of this might just be window dressing at this point, unfortunately. Like, I just don't know that anyone's going to be able to figure out how best to fit three guys who aren't great shooters and how to address the roster that doesn't have a guy who can create off the dribble very well. It's just not how the game is played these days.
Bryan Toporek joining us here on the Boardwalk Kind of Hotline on 97.3 ESPN. Make sure you check out the NBA podcast. He's the co-host of. Also, follow him on Twitter at @BToporek. Bryan, let's do a couple quick hits around the NBA playoffs. We know that, as you mentioned, the Rockets are up 2-0 now in their series. I think there's a lot of people who are wondering, one, is this the Rockets' year? And two, how much better can the Rockets be when Russ is back on the court?
Yeah, I mean, it very well might be. I think, if anything, these first few days of the playoffs have proved no top seed is safe. I mean, now Bucks, Clippers, Lakers, all of whom entered, in theory, the bubble and the playoffs as the favorites, have all lost a game. I'm not too worried about the Bucks moving forward, but Lakers and Clippers, I think, are actually in legitimate dogfights in the first round here. And so the Rockets, I mean, it's just their variance is so high right now because they're just going to bomb 50-plus shots from deep. And the question is, do they hit enough to stay in a game? And can they play good enough defense without a traditional center? And so far against OKC, the answer is yes. I mean, Jeff Green off the bench for them has been really big. Ben McLemore has been nice. Austin Rivers, like, they're getting good contributions. Eric Gordon, I know he had kind of a rough game today, but he's been a lot better in the bubble than he was throughout most of the season. So then, yeah, you add Russ back into this mix at some point, and especially given the Lakers' offensive execution issues, if you're looking ahead to a possible second-round series with them, I mean, at this point, I think a Rockets-Lakers series would probably be a toss-up, if not in favor of the Rockets. So I think the shooter's gym thing plays in well here too. I mean, we've seen that going into the bubble, we kind of thought defense would be ahead of offense. And as it turns out, a lot of these guys are just drilling shots at an unreal rate because I guess it's like there's something in terms of depth perception with no fans in the stands. And also it's just the same gym night after night. So they're getting used to that environment. So that kind of plays into the hands of a team like Houston that's just going to, again, shoot 50-plus threes. And today they only shot 33.9%, but they still hit 19 threes. And really, it was a close game until the fourth quarter. But, if James Harden's only shooting 5 of 16, Eric Gordon shooting 6 of 20, you don't have Russ and you still win that game. That's a dangerous team right there.
You mentioned the Lakers. Of course, we'll be having the Lakers game tonight here on 97.3 ESPN. Lakers Trailblazers game 2. I don't think that any of us are going to be like Charles Barkley and say that the Portland is going to sweep the Lakers. But if you had to put a percentage on it, how much in danger are the Lakers in right now, being down 1-0 to a Blazers team? Let's be realistic. If they were healthy all year, they'd probably be the 4 or the 5 seed.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, my co-host on the pod, Morton Jensen, picked the Blazers to win this series. He didn't say sweep, but he did say win, and I made fun of him when we were doing our preview prediction, and then I had to eat my words when we recapped all of these game ones. I think, in terms of percentage, I would still favor the Lakers in this series, but we're getting close to toss-up territory. We'll see what happens tonight. The Lakers shot extremely poorly from the field the other night. I don't necessarily think that will happen again. There's been a couple people on Twitter who pointed out their shot quality wasn't much different than it was during the regular season when they were knocking down a higher volume of those shots. But I think the Avery Bradley loss, he opted out of the bubble, that looms really large for them. We'll see if Rajon Rondo comes back anytime soon. They just need another ball handler in that rotation. That will help a lot. I think Anthony Davis, it's been discussed a lot in recent days. These lineups with him at the 4, he might need to just, we kind of thought all year, like, okay, they're saving him for the playoffs. They're going to play him at the 4 next to JaVale McGee, Dwight Howard, so he's not getting too much wear and tear on his body. Okay, but now it's the playoffs, so we might need to see more of Davis at the 5, LeBron at the 4, 3 shooters on the wings, and, stretch them out with some spread pick and rolls. The Blazers defense has been horrendous this year. So I think if the Lakers knock down a couple more shots, this is a very different discussion that we're having today. And I think now being down 1-0, we'll see a much more focused Lakers team coming in tonight. But you're totally right. This Blazers team is, I know they are technically the 8 seed, but they are playing at the caliber of a much higher seed. And we're seeing that with Dallas in this Clippers series as well. Dallas is a 7 seed, but had Kristaps Porzingis not gotten ejected from game 1, there's a real chance the Clippers are down 2-0 right now.
He's Bryan Toporek. Check out the NBA podcast. He's the co-host. Also, he's quality editor for Bleacher Report, and he writes for Forbes Sports. And as all guests, he appeared today on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Bryan, appreciate the time. I'm sure we'll be in touch soon as the ebb and flow of the NBA season continues.
Oh, yes. Hopefully we won't talk about the Sixers too much anymore. We got one more week of that, I think.
Well, eventually we got to put a cap on it, right? We got to bury them and put them to rest.
Yes. The sooner the better.
And Sixers coverage here on Game Night on 97.3 ESPN being brought to you by Cross County Connection, the region's Transportation Management Association. They are dedicated to improving the quality of life in South Jersey through transportation solutions. Learn more at www.driveless.com for a Cross County Connection, bringing you Sixers coverage and conversation here on Game Night on 97.3 ESPN.